Good afternoon. I am Mark Cohn and moderator for this featured panel discussion on one of the most important developments in cybersecurity. The Secure Access Service Edge, or SASE, is a cloud-based security architecture resulting from the dramatic shift to the cloud. SASE represents a response to a rise in the remote workforce and cloud migration of applications and data that have been underway for years, but of course in 2020 were accelerated by the COVID-19 pandemic. In this afternoon's session, our expert panel will share their unique perspectives on SASE and offer a glimpse of how their respective organizations are responding. Our panelists include an end user representing one of the most prominent SaaS providers, a cloud-based service provider leveraging their edge assets, an SD-WAN technology leader evolving to deliver edge security, and an early SASE market leader delivering a range of security services. Our panelists are pioneers of the network virtualization movement that's reshaped both enterprise networking and telecommunications, and are active participants in the open networking standards and open source initiatives. As this is a pre-recorded question, we will not be able to take your questions live, but encourage you to email them so that we can respond following the session. The email address will be provided by the conference organizers. Before getting started, I invite each of the panelists to introduce themselves and share their interest in SASE. So I'll start with Chris.
Hi, I'm Chris Donnelly, and I'm the Director of Network Security for Salesforce. My team is responsible for protecting our production data centers all around the globe to make sure that we are offering the best availability to our customers and the best access for our employees. Our interest, Mark, as you were saying, is that we're looking for how we make the network better in this brand new world. I've been working from home now for probably the last 9 months, and I know that many other people have from this panel as well. So we constantly look for how do we do better. Up to this point, we've been, I think all of us, based on going into an office and having connectivity from an office to where we are. Now everybody's at home. How do we offer the maximum security for everything we're doing while dealing with the reality of everybody working from home? So I'm looking at SASE as a possible solution for this, as a way to improve the experience and also improve the security for all of us in this brave new world.
Thank you, Chris. Next, I'm going to go to Patrick.
Hi, good afternoon. Patrick Sullivan, security strategy with Akamai Technologies. And really for Akamai, we kind of pioneered the notion of being an edge platform more than 2 decades ago. And we've really since then been, focused on network and security optimization, really at the edge of the network, even so far as to actually see some of the compute pushed out to the edge. So definitely seeing the same trends that Chris spoke about. We're seeing more applications migrate more towards kind of an edge SASE architecture, given some of the shifts that we've seen in 2020 with compute and workforce migration out of kind of the corporate campus.
Next, I'd like to ask Neil to introduce.
Yes, my name is Neil Danilovich, and I am the principal architect for Versa Networks. And just like everybody else, we've seen a huge uptick in the customers coming and looking for solutions that are secure in nature, but also providing that network performance and the user experience improvement for solutions. And so it's really interesting to see how the industry is moving to this edge now that is sort of elastic, meaning, you know, we've all thought of the office as, you know, a building you go to and a network that you connect to at a location. And now it's becoming more of the offices anywhere that the actual employee is, whether that be at home, whether that be at Starbucks, whether that be the library, or whether that be, you know, the business salesman just traveling around. And that's what we're seeing, but it's causing a lot of stress on both vendors and service providers because now they have to ramp up this capacity to a scenario that was unprecedented prior to the COVID-19 pandemic. All this is just leading to more standard ways and more consistent ways of doing a secure access service edge and security that is now blended in with the network that has to be tightly coupled, because the last thing that anybody wants to do is just increase their security perimeter and their complexity. So we need this framework to make sure that it can be delivered in a very tightly coupled network and security with possibly a single pane of glass to do the orchestration and the monitoring.
Thank you. And Amir.
Thank you. Amir Levy, Director of Product Management for Cloud Platform in Zscaler. Maybe Zscaler requires a little bit of introduction in this for this audience. So Zscaler is a 12 years record of building a SASE cloud-first solution over more than 150 data centers around the globe. The company was founded under the notion that the modern workplace is changing. And as my fellow colleagues here said, we're seeing a rapid shift to the cloud from the application point of view and from users, and they no longer come and work from the office. And that shift for work from anywhere happened before COVID, but now with COVID, even more so. In fact, we've seen an uptick of traffic of more than 14x of working with the remote work solutions. Furthermore, I think that SASE and the approach is taking advantage and looking forward in enabling application, looking beyond the old perimeter, the castle and moat approach that was a good fit for the old network paradigm, but now we as users, we as vendors and customers, we are seeing this transformation and looking forward to look for how we enable application. We focus on user experience and security as paramount to the overall consumption and productivity. So no longer network security, but much more of an overall security approach and enablement of the applications.
All right, thank you. And I'm going to now move into our first question, which is going to be posed to the entire panel. All of you are interested in SASE. That's why obviously you were invited to join this session. But I would appreciate if you could share a glimpse at least of what your individual and even organizational interest is in SASE. What activities are going on? Are you actually delivering a product or service in this area? Is this an area that you're still evaluating? Wherever it is, just let's get started. And I'd like to get Patrick's perspective first.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think for Akamai, you know, the notion of delivering security from the edge is something that we've been doing for more than a decade. You know, I think what we first saw in terms of trends were business to consumer applications moving that inspection out to the edge. And I think now we're seeing more workforce type of applications moving in that direction. But I think that the trends that we see there is as compute moves from, you know, a centralized corporate data center, maybe to infrastructure as a service and SaaS, as the users become distributed, as I think we all touched on, really it's important to understand the optimal point of inspection, and we think that that is the edge. So by our definition, that's about 4,000 POPs that we operate inside about 1,500 ISPs. We want to be very deep inside of an ISP because we think that's kind of the point of optimal security inspection. So specific services there are things centered around web applications, around zero trust access to those applications, inspection of egress traffic from the client. Those are some of the leading services that we provide out of the kind of litany of SASE services as defined by Gartner. And I think some of the other trends that we see there is, maybe even some of the compute finds its way out to the edge as we move forward as well as applications are re-architected.
I think we'll go to Neil next and get a vendor's perspective.
Yeah, so I completely agree with everything that Patrick said here. And from Versa, being a leading SD-WAN and security company, we envision this as being just the natural evolution of what it needs to take in the network to deliver the security that the customer requires. And it's interesting to note that a lot of people enter into this and they look at it from the business perspective, but in the end, what everybody needs to, or most enterprises want, is just a complete secure of their network, and then allowing their customers to get the customers and their employees to actually get to what they need to get to, and protection from the client, from the target, and access to the target, but also protection and evaluation of the people that are actually using their network, right? They want to make sure that people aren't doing things that they're not supposed to do, right? That you have the qualified authorization. And so Versa offers a lot of products that help in this space, and we're constantly implementing more. But I think that the biggest thing that Versa is really open to is working with the standards committees like the Metro Ethernet Forum and the Open Networking User Group to make sure that these concepts are well defined, well understood, and easily implementable in a standard way that allows for organizations to have faith in the service providers actually being able to provide this, and working with certification companies such as Spirent to make sure that the solutions can actually be validated.
All right, thank you. And Amir, you've already given us a indication of what Zscaler is all about, when SASE is a big part of it. Do you want to elaborate a little bit?
Sure. So I would like to echo what Neil was saying and Patrick, and kind of take stock a little bit into what kind of transformation we're seeing here. So I think in the old world, data centers were kind of the center of gravity for everything. We looked at data center migration, data center network, access to data centers as the be-all for all security, but also for all services. I think we now see that the cloud is the new data center. We also see a transformation in the way we architect the network itself. It's no longer an hub and spoke one. The one, had its purpose and served us well, but now that data center are no longer the center of gravity, there is no much reason to architect the network around it. The internet is in fact the new network, and we should focus our view, and that's something that we are partnering, and Akamai is a big force there. And in terms of a security approach, obviously, if you no longer focus on data center, and the one is no longer a major factor, so castle and moat approach of building a huge security stack at the edge of the data center doesn't no longer fits the overall architecture. So remote access applications like VPNs no longer fits the bill. So and we're seeing customers, and especially during COVID, you saw that scaling of VPNs and coming back and doing all the network gymnastic to come back to a network that's becoming less and less relevant is less of a desirable approach. So in the end of the day, we need to focus on how do we get the user to connect to their application, as simple as it gets. The platform that SASE is calling for and define, I think Gartner is echoing what we are hearing a lot from a lot of customers. They want protection. They don't feel like, because the internet is the new network, it means that everything in the internet is safe. They want protection against data leakage. They want to protect the application and the data. They want to protect the actual users. They don't feel like protecting the network has any validity. A lot of infiltrations are happening within. So I think another very important note that Gartner makes about SASE is that the SASE platform should not be assembled out of bits and pieces that are cobbled together. And I think Neil said it well around single pane of glass, but this is not just viewing and monitoring and orchestrating. This is an overall approach that needs to be cohesive and needs to focus on what the productivity requirements are. And the king of productivity probably is right here, with Salesforce. But we've seen how many of those, big network architecture of the old world are just not a good fit if the focus is, I want to get Office 365. I want to get to Salesforce. Why can I get better network performance at home without a VPN than at work? So I think that's the big transformation that SASE is calling for, and that's it's a pretty big pretty big change.
Thank you, Amir. And speaking of Salesforce, Chris, maybe you can offer the end user perspective as our honorary constituent in that area.
Sure. And I want to focus really on the end user, the person working at home who's trying to get connectivity. We've talked a lot about the provider side, but now that we have people working out of their houses or from Starbucks or from wherever, how much do you trust their perimeter? How much do you trust the home networks? How much do you trust the off-the-shelf routers? Or whatever the Wi-Fi access point is at the coffee shop. Is the user coming in from a secure perspective, and do we want to extend our perimeter all the way out to that user? I think this is where SASE becomes interesting, that there's an intermediate point where we can extend the perimeter, where we can bring in a lot of controls, if we do it right, we can improve the user experience by offering low latency connections, by not being tied to specific pieces of hardware and capacity limits on the specific pieces, and coming at it from a comprehensive solution gives us an opportunity to reevaluate the experience and look at ways of improving it for everybody.
Thank you. And it's interesting. I think the theme of work from home is going to definitely be one we're going to be addressing throughout the rest of this session. So now I want to move into some individual questions that are going to be directed based on everybody's area of expertise. And what we were looking to do is to allow everyone to showcase what their perspective is and their experience has been. So Neil, I'm going to start with you. Versa, of course, has grown tremendously over the last few years and has emerged as certainly one of the SD-WAN market leaders, not just for enterprise, but in particular for managed service providers, which is particularly important to the telecommunications space. And on that note, Gartner's perspective on this, since Gartner is the, I would say, the pioneer for SASE, their perspective is that SASE represents the convergence of network and security, not just in terms of technologies, but even starting to think about organizations. So what I wanted to explore is, first of all, can you share why networking vendors and SD-WAN companies in particular, such as Versa, are transitioning to the security space? And then can you, again, give us some more insights about that journey that Versa has took, starting from where you began and then now
where we are
security today.
Yeah. So the story for Versa is actually one that really aligns a lot with SASE and the SASE emergence. Versa started out in the data center space, but quickly it was about data center security, security monitoring, all that type of stuff. And that was a very congested space, and we quickly moved into software-defined wide area networking, really embracing that idea of how to improve the user experience. But we never forgot the security aspects. We always had the security built in with the platform. Now that we have this convergence of security and networking, it's really just highlighting the model that we've always been espousing, is that just as Amir Levy said, there's nothing wrong with a model that tightly couples disjointed security and network components. And even Gartner says that is a possibility, but they stress that it must be tightly integrated and tightly coupled. And the more moving parts you have that you have to tightly couple together, the harder it is to keep it tightly coupled, especially as companies want to innovate and they want to improve their product. So having a structure that is, to some extent, already integrated and already multi-tenant actually helps all of this go further. Now, we talk about this where we want to move the security aspects to the cloud. We want to move it to software-defined elements that don't necessarily tie to an individual platform or to an individual region or individual location. But one of the things that even Gartner realizes is somehow the user has to get to those access points, right? They have to get to those security checkpoints. And so if you read what Gartner says, is they make a core component to SASE SD-WAN, because they envision that you're going to need to have this policy-based decision about how to get the user to the actual security point. The other thing that is transitioning and is different in the security space as old is the whole mantra of security. When we talk about zero trust network access, this isn't the old, the moat and castle style where somebody let down the drawbridge and then you entered the castle. And then once you entered the castle, no one watched you. You just kind of went around in the castle and did what you did. No, this is now where you continually have to monitor not just the actor, not just the user or the device the user is using or the application that the user is using, but you need to monitor, as Chris said, the environment in which the user is coming from, right? So that if there is like a security breach at Starbucks and you have your users sitting at Starbucks using the Starbucks Wi-Fi, you need to know that, and your threat level for that individual has to evolve appropriately, and the authorization and the access and the policies that would be applied to that have to evolve. So this is a lot of the information that the MEF is working in the SASE work group, MEFW 118, that I co-chair. We're working on doing this. Versus already has the capabilities of actually monitoring all this stuff and dealing with the zero trust and dealing with this. Where it's going to be interesting is how we evolve to the individual piece parts, right? Because you have your identity management. And what we're seeing the trends is there are some people who will give over to identity management to a third party that makes it easy to integrate with. But a lot of times enterprises don't want to give up that control. They want to still keep their identity management inside their environment. So now we have to figure out how we get enterprises' identity management to be able to be authorized and to be able to influence all of the policy decisions. But by now making this not about routing, not making it about security, but making it more about the policy that the subscriber or consumer wants to actually apply, we now can do things like decide that we'll use a thin client at where the access point is, and maybe do some firewall rules there, but we'll do a lot more of the heavy lifting stuff like DLP or proprietary information, credit cards, social security numbers, swiping, might be done at a higher point, including malware might be done there. And this is going to become really important as the network evolves, right? Because we all talked about the clouds moving, but we know that the network's evolving. And so with the 5G promise and the different network slices and the low latency and the quick access, now it's no longer a worry about, is my network going to add latency? No, I'm going to be able to get to the compute very quickly. So if I can get to the proper resources, whether that be in Akamai, whether that be in cloud, or whether that be through any other of the middle mile or service providers, that's what we need to do. And that's what, SD-WAN companies hope to really bring to the set. And by tightly coupling the security into it, we're going to enable SASE service providers, and we're going to enable end user customers to have a solution that scales all the way down to possibly an agent on a laptop so that I could go anywhere, or to the point where you just get to the closest point of presence and you only have to worry about the last mile.
Yeah, that's an interesting transition, because what we're going to see is not only security evolving, but the networking evolving as well, and not just evolving as much as the attention that's being paid to the upper layers, which is traditionally not where a lot of the telecommunication environment has been to date. But certainly the cloud industry looks at it as a solved problem. Next, Patrick, I want to go to you. And Akamai, of course, is providing core CDN services for a long time, and other security services around the tremendous presence you built in the edge. And as an expert in the edge, why don't you comment on what the role of the edge is in SASE, and then also offer your assessment of the state of the edge and how Akamai intends to leverage your strengths and capitalize on the opportunity.
Sure. Yeah, there's probably three waves. Mark, I think the first wave we saw was public web applications, and really there is a similar set of drivers. As compute moved from corporate data centers to being sort of hybrid between the corporate data center and cloud, it really presented a similar challenge. About a decade ago, where it didn't make sense to buy appliances that you sit in your corporate data center if that compute is going to be fractured between cloud and your data center. So we really saw sort of the public web application security industry migrate to the edge, right? And I think, to the point that Neil said, that's about security, but then it also unlocks network performance. So if your security inspection point is extremely close to a user, regardless of what ISP or where they are around the world, that's kind of your inspection point. And then it doesn't matter where compute is, or if compute is distributed across many points, you've kind of removed that. So it unlocks this network and security symbiotic relationship where, more efficient security inspection yields more efficient network topology. So sort of the second wave I think that we're seeing in 2020 is around, I think, the trend that every single one of the panelists has spoken about. You know, as an employee, I reside in Northern Virginia. I'm sure Chris has dozens of instances here around Northern Virginia, around the Ashburn area. But if I were to use a VPN, my company's headquartered in Cambridge, Massachusetts. So I historically would have my traffic, you know, route through Boston to come back to a data center, maybe for a SaaS application that sits in a data center that I could see from my house. So with the SASE model, it's that same type of optimization. Perform that security inspection, you know, regardless if it's in my wired network or my wireless network, intercept that traffic, proxy it there, make a security decision, and then free the network architects to have more optimal flow between those locations. And then I think maybe in terms of kind of where things are headed next, you know, it doesn't get a lot of coverage in SASE, but I think that the shift that we're seeing, not just in employees, but in compute, is as modern applications are written, the dominant form for a modern application these days is a microservices architecture, where rather than a monolithic application, you break that up into bits and pieces. And I think the next evolution is some of those microservices would be optimally run at the edge. So some of that compute shifts. So that's the trend that's earlier today. You know, I think the public web and you know, I think now we're in the second wave. The next wave is probably moving that compute itself in part out to the edge, where some of the compute is actually taking place there at the edge as well, in addition to security shifting to the edge.
Thank you. There's no doubt that the edge is going to be where it's at, and 5G is going to be one of those enablers. So, Chris, again, I'm relying on you to sort of inject some market reality as a potential customer for SASE. I'm curious to get your thought on where the market actually is. I mean, from what opportunities do you see for those who are providing SASE technology? What are the factors that, again, from the end users or from your perspective, would affect adoption, both pluses and minuses? And and again, there's some assumption here, but when would you expect that SASE would be a mainstream technology, you know, given the tremendous interest that we've seen, especially over the last year?
Sure. So just to start off with, we're still evaluating. We haven't made any commitments to the technology. But with that said, you know, what I find interesting about it is, you know, the security has to be a given. This needs to raise our security posture. This needs to absolutely protect our customers' data, our employees' data, anyone accessing our platform. We want to have maximum security for them. Beyond that, to extend what people are saying, I'm looking at operations. How do we run this? And how do we fit this in with what else we're working on with the rest of our network? How do we offer low latency and a good user experience? You know, what I've seen so far is that the SASE marketplace is very diverse right now. A lot of people are using the SASE label for many different types of services, and everybody has a different level of emphasis. You know, for me, I want to see the operations of this. You know, what is the reach for the different providers? What is the latency like running connections through there? How well can I tie this in with automation or existing playbooks, existing workflows? And how do we build this into a comprehensive solution as opposed to, as Amir was mentioning, a bunch of different point products. You know, I like the idea of being able to have this secure perimeter that's close to the user, where we can maximize that security and where we don't have to worry about the VPN, as Patrick was mentioning, about you know, connecting from your house to wherever the corporate VPN server is, to wherever you're trying to go. If we can use the SASE solution and use essentially the benefits of the clouds to shorten that distance, then everybody wins.
Always good to see how the real world is meeting some of the hype, especially from some of our analyst friends who are really assuming that SASE is going to take over the universe in the near future and it's not going to be too long. Well, I think we're getting a better sense of what's real and what's not so real. And another big challenge, I was asking Patrick to enlighten us about what's happening at the edge. Well, Amir, I want to go the other direction. Can you talk about how SASE's reshaping the endpoints as well? I mean, we get a huge benefit of being able to offload security capabilities that are hard to manage and deploy at the endpoint. What is going to happen there? And can you specifically talk about some of the zero trust developments that were alluded to earlier?
Of course. So I think if we go back to kind of where we started looking at what SASE is calling for, we're seeing three basic tenets. First tenet being branch with a router and a cloud security. And SASE is calling specifically, and I think Neil also talked about this, CPE should be thin and the cloud should be enabled to address the security and the need for better security and better access. So compute power at the edge to the endpoint is designed to help with the enforcement and to provide capabilities at the edge, at the endpoint, or closest to the endpoint. And I think Chris reemphasized this from his point of view, that the perimeter should be as small as the application or the launch or even the browser sandbox accessing the application in the cloud. And then we shouldn't forget that we're using possibly a medium that's is not protected. So encryption at scale is also a very important element that we should not forget. So when we try to bring in and to look at, okay, so how is this all plays? I think there is four generally accepted the use cases that we need to look at when we evaluate the SASE and when we look at the overall architecture. The first aspect is how do we get cyber protection? How do we know that the URL we're clicking is actually what we think that we are supposed to be entering? Identity management is part of it. Data protection is part of it. We need to protect intellectual property. We need to protect against data infiltrations and areas, and stories that, got a lot of pose and a lot of people's mind about how safe is the internet and the cloud. So from the other side, and application access, and I think Mark, you're right. We're not becoming SASE, but just saying SASE 5 times. We need to talk about the transition. We need to look into zero trust network access and other technologies that enables data centers application to be safe and secure and focus on the user experience. And I think that's an important tenet in the SASE architecture, as well as, and I think Neil mentioned it, and Patrick as well, cloud workload security and data protection within the cloud. And you know, as we encapsulate a lot of the functionality in the data in the cloud, we need to not forget that you know, some basics element of security need to be enabled. And again, you know, we don't need to go back and define the cloud perimeter, but rather look forward and understand how the application architecture should be evolved and enabled by those technologies. And kind of to sum it all up, and you know, another user experience is also needs to be in the back of the mind of everything we do. You know, Chris mentioned the latency. You know, you can't migrate to cloud if you don't think through the experience of the end users. We've seen a lot of companies that really wanted to move to the cloud, but then if the architecture is not enabled and the user experience suffers, and obviously it's a major hump in getting to where we want to go. So I think a user experience, a digital experience, or looking through the overall application access latency in viewing the overall data experience is also a major part of cloud first architecture. So to sum it up, I think it's a transition. It's a transition that requires a lot of rethinking and shift. And we're seeing the transition happening in front of our eyes. And I think there is a lot of momentum and a lot of good productivity that everybody enjoys from this transition and migration.
All right. So now I'm going to move back to another topic that we touched upon earlier, but I'd like to get into a little more detail. And Neil, I'm going to ask you to get the discussion started, which is the MEF recently approved a number of standards projects. There have been other groups that have been touching upon security for quite a long time, and frankly struggling to actually take standards to something real. So what I wanted to first ask Neil to do is, can you just describe what those security projects really are? And then secondly, for the rest of the panel, because everyone will have an opportunity, can you touch upon your perspective on what, you know, the role of standards in SASE and open source as well? But Neil, I wanted to specifically talk about the MEF projects because they are directly relevant.
So MEF, as you know, has been trying to get into doing all kinds of standards. And they recently, I think in 2019, published the first standard for SD-WAN. And I believe right now we have somewhere in the neighborhood of about 100 different service providers and vendors that are now certified against that standard, meaning that they will operate in a framework that can be validated, right? Not just saying we have SD-WAN, but we do that. But going from that, they went and said, okay, so now that we've done SD-WAN, let's look at what we need to do. And they started with MEF W88, which was application security, because they realized that while you had this network, application security was absolutely paramount. And so they started that work, and that work now has a draft standard already being published to the rest of the standards committees to actually validate in the industry, and they're hoping that that will actually be standard by the end of this year, early of next year. Following on top of that, because we know that the application security itself is not the end all be all, two very glaring holes in the SD-WAN standard came apart, which was zero trust. So a zero trust framework has actually been approved at the last meeting to actually be the next project. And what this framework is doing is building a framework that can be utilized by SD-WAN, but can also be utilized by other projects on how you would deal with actually validating and authorizing an entity to actually use the network. And we're taking this not just from the actor perspective or the user perspective, but also to, as Amir Levy referenced, validating that the actual target or the application or the device or whatever it is that the user wants to access is actually really what they want to access, right? And it all comes down to, you have to make sure that everything along the path is actually what it's supposed to be and doing what it is, and there's nothing there. So zero trust just assumes that you don't trust anybody and you force everybody to actually authorize, go through authentication and authorization based upon the policy of the system. And the shift here for zero trust is that it's a continual compliance to that. So you're constantly monitoring. It's not a one-time thing. Then the last one was SASE, right? So we can talk about zero trust and we can talk about applying that to, say, a security aspect, or we can say apply that to a network-based access, but that doesn't pull it all together. SASE pulls it all together. SASE basically says, I'm going to take the user and I'm going to take it all, in MEF they call it an actor. I'm going to take the actor and I'm going to take it all the way to the target, and I'm going to do it in a way that is secure and is constantly secure, and it's going to be done based upon some sort of policy. And so that was started, and I'm co-editing that along with Daniel Barlev from the MEF organization. And we hope to have that standard out by the middle of next year. That, you know, it's kind of our target, middle of next year to the end of next year, get that standard out. Given that we have a good track record for doing SD-WAN, which came, you know, I think it was 3 to 4 years after SD-WAN really became mainstream. And then it took them two or 2.5 years to actually build a standard. We're now, you know, starting this when SASE is really just coming to the forefront, right? You know, I think Gartner coined this middle of last year, or, you know, maybe the first quarter of last year. So we're really at the forefront, and getting all the different vendors and service providers together, we now think we can shorten that curve and come up with something that works. And everything that we're doing is really a framework, you know, just talking more about what should be done, not how you do it, but what the requirements should be to make sure that a solution is secure, a solution takes into account the user experience, a solution takes into account every aspect, if you can, of what it needs to be, and evolving it in the industry to be something that is mutable and transformable, because it doesn't make any sense for us to create just a new version of the castle and moat, right? Because we know that networking and networking in general is advancing at a hyper speed, right? So it's no longer taking us 20 years to get from, you know, the digital age into the space age. It's now, you know, we're doing that in sometimes in matters of months, right? Especially when like a pandemic forces us to actually do something quicker than everybody wanted to. So I think that's the interesting part. And I think that's kind of where the standards bodies can help, but it does take a community to put this together.
So what you're saying is that MEF 88, the application security for SD-WAN standard, is really addressing the security functions. And then MEF, the activities surrounding the Zero Trust project is addressing how that user is going to access or at least gain the credentials needed to access the overall environment. SASE, the project that MEF has, is an architecture project. And actually, one of the other projects that you didn't mention, but recently was approved, is a new project that is exploring how we actually test security, which is going to be very different than network test. That is also going to be, so MEF is looking at it holistically. They're not just looking at, here's SASE security or something distributed. They're trying to look at it more holistically, which is why it's of interest and why I wanted to explore it here. However, I wanted to go to another veteran of the standards and open source community. Chris, can you maybe share an external perspective? I mean, I know you're not directly involved in the MEF activity, or may or may not in the future, but what's your sense of this kind of activity based on the extensive experience that you have?
Having a standards activity starts to set the bar. It helps the industry to define what the term means. We talked earlier in this panel about how SASE means many different things to many different people. If we have an architecture, if we have a specification that we can point to and say this is the common definition, it makes it easier for companies to consider it in RFIs, RFPs down the road, because there's a standard set of definitions and people can know that they're comparing apples with apples instead of apples with oranges. It won't set the top bar, and it won't set acceptance criteria per se, but it'll get the ball rolling. And then Mark, you mentioned open source, and having early open source available helps people start testing with it and playing with it and seeing how these concepts fit into an organization, into tools, and it accelerates the adoption period instead of having to wait for something to come all the way to market and be hardened and ready for adoption, and then try to adapt it into the networks. If we can get it early as open source, then we can get a look at the value proposition earlier and then test it out and see whether it's the reality is matching the marketing hype.
So Patrick, Neil sort of laid out the landscape for the standardization project. Chris who has given us some insights about how the standards and open source can be used to really validate the architecture, and also to really allow the user community to at least the technology community to coalesce around a baseline, so we can take a step toward the ultimate goal, which is a multi-vendor environment. But I want to get a sense from Akamai's environment, or maybe not to put your company on the spot, of course, but your perspective on, so let's talk about in practice where this is. What's your take on all this? We don't necessarily have to have a pure journey to achieve standards. I just want to get your pragmatic sense.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think, in general, you want to build to standards wherever you can. And I think the good news is, if you're following, web protocols, there's a number of standards there. Maybe to touch on a point that Amir made, I think a really important point, one of the shifts we're seeing with SASE is moving inspection from the network layer up to layer 7. So a whole series of really interesting standards that you have to keep an eye on are really all around the cryptographic standards as TLS evolves, as DNS gets encrypted. So that's an area we spend a lot of time. Obviously we're seeing, I think we all talked about just the huge surges in traffic online in 2020. We're seeing, getting close to 200 terabits a second, and we decrypt and inspect and re-encrypt almost all of that. So it's really, really important that you can do that efficiently, and there's nothing in the, a spec that evolves that would disrupt that. And then I think for somebody, maybe who's listening, saying, I want to move down the path of SASE or Zero Trust. NIST did a great job with their document that went final, I think, last month, just kind of laying out the primitives. If you were going to move to a Zero Trust architecture, how would you do? How would you go about that? What are the things you should keep in mind? And, as always, NIST kind of builds that out, thinking about the next 10 years, not just, the next 10 weeks. So really kind of foundational advice that you can easily borrow from.
No, thank you. And Amir, we have just a few minutes left. Do you have any additional insights to offer on the role of standards in open source and what they're playing in SASE?
I think standards and standard communities play important role in every step of the way. We see that from the importance of sharing malware information or URL or just basic techniques between the security companies and making sure that we protect the users wherever they are. And the importance, and I think where MEF is stepping up is helping us making SASE not just a kind of a word on the paper, but actual technology and interoperation and testing, as my colleague mentioned here. So I think that's a really important work, and I think it's a vivid community, and we are all looking forward to see how can we work together on some aspect. Some of us are competitors, but I think we all understand that in the process of bringing transformation, it's actually when the sea rise, all boats rise. So we definitely see the importance of working together and standardizing through open source, and I think we're going to see how the MEF work is going to help us move forward as an industry for a more standard and more user-centric approach for overall cloud applications.
Thank you. I mean, I certainly understand that standards is playing a role in a lot of technology adoption, and here it's just more involved because as Patrick was pointing out, it's not just about the architecture level. There's a number of things happening up and down the stack, and Patrick, thank you for talking about some of the encryption activities that are going on that I'm somewhat aware of, but not to the extent that you are, of course. But we only have a few minutes left, so I want to just want to thank the panelists for your insights. I want to also just make sure that everybody in the audience who's thinking about this starts to look at some of the activities that are underway. Certainly go look at what Gartner's doing, but at the same time, the MEF is addressing this in a pretty broad way, and they have a lot of commitment to not just the MEF organization, but the MEF community of service providers, as well as technology providers who are really diving in to SASE and security in general. The other thing I wanted to mention is that for those of you who are interested in security in the managed services area, please join us for the next session in this track, which is also going to address security. It's called Managed Security in the Cloud Era. And there we're going to also talk about some areas that are specifically directed around the emergence of managed services and security. So again, thank you to the panel. Thank you to the audience for joining. And please refer to Layer 123 about where you send your questions, but we invite your questions. We will respond to them offline, and we will make sure that we get the responses back. And we wish you a productive event as it winds down. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mark.
Thank you.
Thank you. I just stopped the recording. I thought the panel went excellent. I want to thank everybody for their interesting insights. I certainly learned some things. I just couldn't take notes, unfortunately. So I might have to follow up with some of you afterwards to close, to wind that down. And again, what when I get the link, I'll send it along. And if anybody has any other comments, questions, or whatever, I'll just send them to everybody, and we can figure out how
They
to
might have
formally respond.
They might have to edit this last part. It still says you're recording.